All right, this is chapter 4, lesson 3, functions. Okay. So a blank is a relation in which every member of the domain, the input value, is paired with exactly one member of the range, the output value. So in that blank, you're going to write function. Okay. So a function is a relation in which every member of the domain is paired with exactly one member of the range. So function, to find the value of a function for a certain number, I can substitute the number for the variable x. So example, f of x, and that's how it sounds, f of x. So f of x is read the function of x, or f of x. It is the output, or the range. Equals 15x. The input, x, is any real number, and that's the domain. So remember we talked a little bit about domain and range the last time, where domain is the x value and range is the y value. So function tables. You can organize the input, rule, and output into a blank blank. In those two blanks, you're going to write function table. The variable for the domain is called the blank blank. It's the independent variable because it can be any number. The variable for the range is called the dependent variable because it depends on the domain. So let's take a look at some examples. Example 1 says find f of -3 if f of x equals 2x plus 1. So basically all I'm doing here is I'm taking the -3 and I'm plugging it in for my x value. So I get f of x equals 2x plus 1. So I want f of -3, so I plug it in. 2 times -3 plus 1. Well, 2 times -3 gives me -6, plus 1 equals -5. For example number 2, it says choose 4 values for x to make a function table for f of x equals x plus 5. Then state the domain and range of the function. So I can choose any value I want for x. Completely up to you. They chose -2, -1, 0, and 1. Okay? So I go ahead and I substitute those in. -2 plus 5 gives me 3. -1 plus 5 gives me 4. 0 plus 5 gives me 5. 1 plus 5 gives me 6. Okay. Then I can state the domain, which are my x values. -2, -1, 0, and 1. And the range, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right. So there are approximately 770 peanuts in a jar of peanut butter. The total number of peanuts, P of J, is a function of the number of jars of peanut butter purchased, J. So I want to, for number 3, identify the independent and dependent variables. So independent and dependent, okay? Since the total number of peanuts depends on the number of jars of peanut butter, the number of peanuts is the dependent, and the jars of peanut butter is the independent variable. Okay? Number 4 says, what values of the domain and range make sense for this situation? So we're referring to the peanut butter situation. Explain. Only whole numbers make sense for the domain because you cannot buy a fraction of a jar. Makes sense. And the range values depend on the domain values, so the range will be multiples of 770. Okay? And they're multiples of 770 because if we go back to the original problem, they said there were approximately 770 peanuts in a jar. Okay, so that's information we got from the original problem. All right. Number 5 says, write a function to represent the total number of peanuts, then determine the number of peanuts in 7 jars of peanut butter. Okay, so the number of peanuts, P of J, equals 770 times the amount of jars, right? So the function, P of J equals 770J, represents the situation. So that's the equation. To find the number of peanuts in 7 jars, I substitute 7 for J. Okay, P of J equals 770J, so I do 770 times 7, or 5,390. So there are 5,390 peanuts in 7 jars of peanut butter. All right, on page 88, there are a couple of try it problems. Go ahead, pause the video, try them out, and when you're done, we will go over the answers together. All right, now that you've had a chance to try out the try it problems, let's go over the answers together. Letter A says, find each function value. So I want to know f of 2 if f of x equals x minus 4. So I'm going to take f of 2 equals x minus 4, and I'll plug in 2 for x. So 2 minus 4 is negative 2. So f of 2 equals negative 2. Okay. Letter B says find each function value, f of 11, if f of x equals 1/2 x plus 5. So I have f of 11 equals 1/2 x plus 5. I'm going to plug in 11 for x. 11 times 1/2 is 5.5. So I have 5.5 plus 5, which is 10.5 or 10.5. Okay. Oops. Letter C says choose 4 values for x to complete the function table for the function f of x equals x minus 7. Then state the domain and range of the function. So I'm going to come over here. Okay. So my function is f of x equals x minus 7. x, and then my y value. Okay, and it says pick 4 values. I'm going to pick -2, -1, 0, and 1. You don't have to pick those 4. You can pick any 4 numbers that you would like. So it's -2 minus 7. -2 minus 7 is -9. -1 minus 7 is -8. 0 minus 7 is -7. And 1 minus 7 gives me -6. So there's my table. Okay. It also wanted me to state my domain and my range. Okay. So my domain is -2, -1, 0, 1. And my range is -9, -8, -7, -6. Okay? So that's completely dependent on what numbers you've chosen. But your domains are your x values and your range are your y values. Okay, for D, E, and F, we're looking at the following problem. It says, a scrapbooking store is selling rubber stamps for $4.95 each. The total sales, F of N, is a function of the number of rubber stamps N sold. So, D asks us to identify the independent and dependent variables. So looking at the problem, the price depends on the amount of stamps sold, right? So the dependent variable is the total sales. And the independent is the number of stamps. Okay, so that's for D. Letter E asks, what values of the domain and range make sense for the situation? Explain. Okay, so for the domain, only whole numbers make sense, since you can't buy part of a stamp. And for the range, you will have multiples of $4.95 because each stamp costs $4.95. Okay, for letter E, it says write a function to represent the total sales, then determine the total sales for 5 stamps. Okay. So my function is f of n equals 4.95 times n, the number of stamps. Because the number of stamps times 4.95 would give me the total price. So my domain gives me my range. And I want to know f of 5. So I plug that in. 495 times 5 gives me $24.75. So there's my function. And there's the price, the total price for 5 stamps. And that is the end of lesson 3.